here to join us for this online talk on community photography in 1970s and 1980s Cambridge. And Roy Hammans and Brian Human, who you can see here on your screens, will be talking today. So I'm Lucy Howie and my co-organiser is Alina Kaku, and we are PhD students and also former curatorial assistants at Kettle's Yard. Alina is at the University of Cambridge researching South Asian artists in Britain in the 1980s, and I'm at the University of St Andrews researching lesbian feminist photography and film in 1980s Britain. This event is part of the ongoing Radical Art in Cambridge research project, which we began in March 2022. And this project sets out to explore the lost history of experimental arts activity in Cambridge in the 1970s to 1980s. So far, we've been fundraising for the project, conducting archival research and interviews, and also we've been holding a series of research events like today. This is our third public-facing event and our first online event. The talk today will be recorded and made available to view online at a later date. So feel free to keep your cameras off if you don't want to be included in the video, and please can everyone remain muted during Brian and Roy's presentation. Today's talk first took place as part of an archival workshop that we held in March 2023. And this was at the Cambridge Central Library, and it explored the beginnings of the St Matthew's photo workshop in the 1970s that you'll hear more about today. So today's online event is an opportunity to listen to this talk again and also to engage in discussion with Brian and Roy afterwards following their presentation. We would also like to direct you to the Cambridge Central Library collection, where following our workshop in March, Brian and Roy donated all of their personal archive material from the St Matthew's photo workshop and the Cambridge Darkroom. Just a final note for me to say that on the 2nd of June this year, we will be holding another workshop with Kettle's Yard, but this will instead explore the Artist in Residence scheme at Kettle's Yard in the 1980s. Additionally, you can also view the recording of our first roundtable event that took place in October 2022. This is on the British Art Network YouTube channel.
Okay, so we're going to start by thanking our speakers, Roy Hammans and Brian Human, who have been extremely generous with sharing their archive material with us and for compiling this history together for this talk today and also for the previous one in person. And we'd also like to thank other people who have supported this event, including Mary Burgess from the Cambridgeshire Collection, Maria Lopez Diaz and Jem Pollard from the Faculty of English, Lisa Gold from the Cambridge Festival, and Sophie Howie. And this event is supported by the Cambridge Festival and the Association for Art History. Okay, so before handing on to Brian and Roy, I'll just start with a very brief introduction to the St Matthew's Photo Workshop, the subject of our discussion today. So the workshop was established in 1978 by 6 photographers living in the St Matthew's area in Cambridge, which was a neglected residential area on the edge of Cambridge city centre, primarily housing railway workers, university non-academic staff and local tradespeople in mainly 2-up, 2-down terraced houses. So the St Matthew's Photo Workshop was set up to document social life in the area, cultivate interest in photography and archive photos from the locality. In 1980, as our previous roundtable explored, the workshop reformed as the Cambridge Darkroom, a community darkroom and gallery that garnered a reputation for its temporary and touring exhibitions, for its joint open exhibitions with Kettle's Yard, darkroom and photography workshops, talks, and film and video screenings. And so this talk today is going to highlight the significance of this activity to British photographic history and to the history of Cambridge. So without further ado, over to you, Brian and Roy, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Brian.
Right. Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Lucy. Right. I guess this is a story of how in a city that didn't really have much of a reputation for the visual arts, and certainly not for photography, became central to development of photographic ideas during the 1980s and 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. This diagram here, which some very assiduous person has put together, a family tree of British photography, shows highlighted three key elements. The second from the top on the right is the Cambridge Darkroom, and that's shown linking into major exhibitions that were held here as part of the work that the Darkroom did, following on from the St Matthew's Photo Workshop. The top right box that's been identified is a slight curiosity, but nevertheless important. It actually refers to the founding of Creative Camera, which was fundamental in developing the attitudes and the approaches to creative photography in the 1960s and from then on. It was founded in 1968. And interestingly enough, one of the people who was working for Creative Camera and redesigned it was Pavel Buchler, who we will meet up with later on. So there's a link there between what happened in Cambridge and what was happening more widely. So where did that really start from? Can we have the next slide, Lucy? Thank you. In the mid to late 1970s, I was working in the planning department, looking at a plan for the St Matthew's area of Cambridge, which, as Alina has explained, was a sort of mainly housing area with a traditional Victorian housing stock. And what we were doing was trying to develop a plan looking for the environmental, physical, and housing improvement in the area, working with the local community, as opposed to a more traditional approach to looking at those areas which would have seen it swept away and new build. So very much about renewal of the existing infrastructure and existing fabric. A friend of mine who was working on the project at the same time, Nigel Hackett and I, got together and decided that we would try to document some aspects of the area. And we put together a small exhibition which was called Another Cambridge, which was shown in the Lineyard Library. Roy subsequently saw this. I'm pleased to say he liked the photographs that we put in, and we got together and we met in the Dewdrop pub in Cambridge and talked about photography, met with other people, and felt that there was an opportunity to establish a group that was really very much focused on looking at how the area was changing, how we could document it, and at the same time develop an interest in photography. And out of that came the St Matthew's Photo Workshop, which very much linked into the whole idea of community development within the area, something that Roy was very heavily involved in. And I think that's where he can now best take over and develop the story.
Yeah. So the St Matthew's Neighbourhood Association was the name given to the group of people, local residents, not photographers, who came together to help support the local plan and to work with the council to make suggestions and to gain views from the local residents of how things should progress. Now, I was very heavily involved in the Neighbourhood Association from the outset, and it was during my time on that the idea occurred to me that wouldn't it be nice if we could somehow incorporate photography, which was my profession at the time, into this whole thing. And so I put out the idea, having spoken with Brian, put out the idea amongst the group that anyone that was interested in photography, would they like to get together and form a small group that would look at ways to document the area and record what was going on in St Matthew's. As you can see, we were quite productive. We used to produce a monthly, or at least monthly, sometimes every 2 months, newsletter, which was all put together in those days before desktop publishing, all with cut and paste on my living room floor. And it tried to keep people in touch with what was happening in the area. And so from that came the St Matthew's Photo Workshop, which is the name, is what we called ourselves to link us to the Neighbourhood Association idea. And because we were heavily involved in the neighbourhood association, we knew what was going on in the area pretty much. And so we had opportunities to go and photograph events and to record what people were up to. And the sort of things we did, well, you can see from this picture, the Save Our Streets campaign to stop through traffic in the area was one of the most major successes, I would say, of the St Matthew's Association. We based ourselves in the bathhouse, which was an old public baths building at the top of Gwydir Street, which is pretty much in the heart of the area. And it was up for demolition at one point. I think the city council didn't know what to do with it. They'd stripped out most of the fittings, but not substantially altered the structure at all. And this building was, we just thought it was a fascinating building. We could use it quite effectively as a centre for people to meet and to rent a room in if they wanted to have meetings of their own, whatever groups they cared to form. And it really did take off. That within that St Matthew's Neighbourhood Association, start off with, there were Friends of the Earth, there was the Marine Action Centre, there was Cambridge Community Relations, there was Cambridge Free Press, and the St Matthew's Neighbourhood Association had an office in there. And so I was there quite a lot during this period. This is 1977, when things were very different to what they are now. I think if we move on to the next slide. 1977 was a time of unrest. You could compare it to some respects to what's going on now, but there were lots of strikes. There was lots of dissatisfaction with the way things were going generally. Rubbish was piling up because the bin men were on strike, and so we photographed all that, obviously, as part of the group's activity. But it was also a time when, in general, there was a much more kind of radical outlook on life. Go on to the next slide, please. Grapevine was Cambridge's community paper, produced by the Cambridge Free Press, 15p, very reasonable, but 1979, as you'll see. Within that edition was an article about our area, St Matthew's, new campaign to stop heavy lorries using one of the depots in the area, or increasing the size of the lorries that they were using in the area, which was a success. We managed to stop that. And also a whole page on the St Matthew's Photo Workshop, roughly at the time it was launched, I suppose. 1979, and explaining exactly what it was and what it did. And we got more interest from the initial 6 people that became involved, grew to about 12 or 15, I think, at one point. And there was a lot of interest. So we thought, well, what we really do need in order to fulfill the brief of this is to have somewhere where people can develop their films and make their prints. In those days, before digital, that's all you could do, right? Sort of send them to the chemist. And surprisingly, we found there was a lot of interest in that idea. So we set about the idea of converting one of the rooms in the Bathhouse Community Centre into a darkroom. I think the next slide. These are some of the rooms. You can see the sort of state it was in when we took it over. All the rooms were like this. They were used by people as best they could. There was heating, not much. There was lighting, and that was about all we had. Running water, oh yeah, and there's one loo. So if you move on to the next slide, well, the one room we identified. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is the central room in the old bath, in the public baths area, which was the sauna room, and it was really this room alone which we felt was serviceable in its existing state. It was all pine panelled, although the flooring had gone. We managed to get furniture and carpets from a local residents and equip it as best we could. And this was used a lot by local residents and groups that wanted a place to meet. It was very cheap to hire. And it was the main reason, really, I think, that the bathhouse became a success. Sorry, next slide. This was the problem with the room we'd identified as a darkroom. This room had the old boiler in it that used to heat the public baths. And to get rid of this was a major operation. This was 1979. There it is, sitting there. What do we do with it? But luckily, one of the groups in the bathhouse at that time were Friends of the Earth. And the guy that ran Friends of the Earth at that time, Eric Blenkinsop, was an engineer student. And if you see the next one, he very kindly undertook, on the next slide, with his colleagues, to clear out the boiler, cut it up with oxyacetylene torches and take out all the massive amount of steel that was in there, which then left us with at least an empty room, so that we could consider what we would do next to get this darkroom underway. We had no funds, but we had a lot of donations from people that were willing to support the idea by giving us equipment and what they could spare. A lot came from the university, which is where I worked, which is not coincidental. But in order to raise funds, And to engage the community even more, we set about several projects within the St Matthew's photo workshop, one of which was an idea I stole from someone in Birmingham. It was called Photograph Yourself. This was in the days before selfies, and people didn't do this kind of thing. But we set up a camera within the bathhouse main meeting room, and it was unattended. We invited people in off the street. We had people out on the street, wranglers getting them in, to come in, be there on their own, take the photograph, one photograph, to represent themselves, and then leave it. And we processed and we printed all of these, and we had amazing selection of people. And this really encapsulates the kind of community there was in that area at the time. A mixture of young and old, mixture of male and female, and it was a real cross section of the area. First person to get photographed, unfortunately, was me. I think if you have the next slide, then you'll see that's what I looked like in 1978. So when I saw that, first of all, I didn't recognize. I thought, who is this? Anyway, that's a long while ago. Next slide, please. So out of all this work that we were doing, and the group by this time was producing quite a massive amount of material, we were photographing everything. And so we thought we had enough material for an exhibition. So we had this idea to do an exhibition that had to be held in the central library, because the bathhouse itself wasn't big enough, and we didn't have a gallery in those days. And so the exposures exhibition, which had a rather radical poster, I suppose, but not back in those days, attracted quite a lot of attention, got good reviews in the paper. And we set it all up ourselves, we printed it ourselves, we hung it ourselves. It was seen by quite a lot of people. It followed on in the following year by Exposures 2, which is a similar exhibition. If the next slide, I think, shows the sort of material we had in there. We photographed everything from boxing matches, the paper collection, heavy lorries in the area in the campaign to stop traffic, pub events, music events, gymnastics, you name it, we covered it. Knobs and knockers, the door letterboxes and everything else was one guy's particular favorite. And we also showed a selection from the Photograph Yourself project there. I think it was around this time, if Mark will correct me, because I think he's in the room with us, but that Mark joined the project. Although he lived on the outskirts of the area, I won't say outside the area because it's very, very close, he became actively involved and very, very soon became an important factor in this whole organization. And that's when Brian and I first met Mark, when he came along to, I think, one of the St Matthew's photo workshop meetings we had in the pub. Next slide, please. So the darkroom, the photo workshop, I keep calling it the darkroom because that's what it became at this stage. We've been running it for a few years, and 2 years, I think, in fact. And in fact, it had got so big that we needed to move on, and we need to think of what to do best, what to do next, and how to do it well. And so there was an open day in the bathhouse where all the groups within the facility were given a chance to promote themselves and what they were doing. And our panel, which you can see bottom left, talked about us, talked about the workshops we ran, talked about our plans. And the plans included at that time a move into the brewery building opposite, now disused, which had a space which we thought would make an ideal gallery. Mark was very active in all aspects of that and came on board in a big way to help plan and organize that whole event. We needed to raise money for it. We did this through running weekend workshops, beginners workshops, all kinds of things and activities that we could think of to get some money together to not only pay the rent on the bathhouse, which we had to pay the council a certain amount for that, but also to raise money to do this really ambitious project of converting a derelict bottling plant within a brewery into a gallery space. We changed our name to the Cambridge Darkroom around this time because we felt that best sort of described our ambitions. We wanted it to be more than just a darkroom. We wanted it to be a centre for excellence in photography in Cambridge and in the region. We got a lot of funding from the Eastern Arts Association as it was. They no longer exist, unfortunately. And through their support and the support of many patrons and people that donated material to us, we were able to really get ourselves organised and move on. If you'd like to have the next slide, please. This got, yeah, okay, we can go on to that. The one before that just briefly, that was a newspaper cutting which described the open day and described, I think, all the groups that were in there at that time. Next slide. So this was the room that had that old cast iron boiler in it. That's me in the front there, and Mark at the back on the left-hand side. After we'd finished converting it to a darkroom, which I think opened in 1978, 79, I think, 79. And we had, all the equipment was donated, the dryers, the largers, the safe lights, the drying cabinets, everything you needed to process and print your own films. This was the group that really did a lot of the work on it, and managed to get it organized in time for our grand opening. As you can see, the charge per session was 75p on weekdays and 125 for evenings or weekends. That's very cheap, even for those days. But anyway, it was a very successful venture, and soon became, something that people just assumed had always been there. Next slide, please. Oh, that's just us getting on with it. So, as I mentioned, the way to raise money for all these activities and our ambitions was to have workshops which were open to everyone in Cambridge, everyone in the region, everyone in the country. They were advertised widely. They featured photographers from well-known photographers from all over the country, where you could come and work with them for a weekend and learn from them and do your own work as well, and process and print it in the Cambridge Darkroom. The beginners' workshops were the mainstay of it all. They ran on a regular basis every 6 weeks or so. And I think 6 people on a course over a period of time. I don't know. I didn't keep a record of how many people went through that, but there were certainly hundreds of people that went through the beginners' workshop. And a real mix as well, a real mix of people. But the weekend workshops became our kind of main feature, if you like. And Ron McCormick, who was a tutor at Newport College, was very kindly came along and did the first one for us, which was a bit of an unknown. We didn't know how many people we were going to get, but it was very successful. Next slide, please. Yeah, it's worth mentioning at this point that the picture you've seen on the poster at the beginning was by Dave Runnicles. Dave Runnicles is the guy in the top left in that slide behind, who came on one of our beginners workshops to learn photography. He went on to successfully apply to Newport College, the documentary photography course, where I think Mark Lumley had been as well. Got a place on the course, which was not an easy thing to do, completed his 2 years course, and came out of it as a documentary photographer working for Times Literary Supplement and many other people as well. So that was one of our main successes. And Dave, all credit to him, completed one of the projects that we did within the Cambridge Darkroom, which was the Ditton Fields project. Next slide, please. So these are some pictures of the other workshops with some of the other names of notables that came to do them for us. Paul Hill, Professor of Photography at Trent and Derby at that time. Ed Barber, well-known photographer in the portraiture field. And Brian Harris, Times photographer, press photographer. John Benton Harris, documentary photographer. Humphrey Spender, what you call him, he was a documentary photographer, worked on Picture Post, had a fantastic history in photography. And all of these people came to run workshops for us. And John Benton Harris, their top right, posing a model, which is not his normal style, but everyone was very flexible about what they did and what they talked about. And a lot of learning went on in those workshops, I think. The bottom right is one we held at Burwell House, away from Cambridge. And that was a colour workshop. That was the first colour workshop we'd run. That in itself was quite an event. Next slide, please. So the exhibitions that we had brought in, created ourselves, we couldn't show them in the bathhouse, it was too small. We continued to show them in the Central Library, but it kind of emphasized the need. The interest was there. There were lots of people interested in this, but there was a need for somewhere central to show this kind of work on a more formal and a more sort of a grander scale, if you like. And that was why the Cambridge Darkroom Gallery really was our ultimate goal, so that we didn't have to keep putting exhibitions up in the library, although successful though it was. We had a wide range there, you know, as a lot of interest, a lot of different photographers, a lot of different styles. But really what we were aiming for at that stage was to get a gallery space of our own and to be able to create our own exhibitions. Next slide, please. So this was the space. The drawings of what we hoped it would look like turned out to be pretty accurate. And this was the publicity material we put out to raise money and to get funding. We have one photograph. It's amazing for a group of photographers. We've got so little documentation on this period. One photograph of the gallery during its phase of construction, which is the building. It's the top of the building on the right hand side there. And below, you've got the people that were the most active within the group during that time. Got Mark Lumley and Pavel Buchler and Brian and myself. They were the core team, but we also had other directors and patrons of the gallery. And we had Aisha Landsman and Adrian Plant, who were really, without them, the whole thing would have kind of fallen apart almost, because they held everything together. Mark was really busy at this time raising money for the darkroom. Pavel was involved in our graphics and our design. He did the drawing at the top there on the right, on the left rather. But basically, this is what we had to work with. And it was during this period, 1983, 1984, the gallery, I think, was complete when the next slide was taken, which was the day the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh drove past it. I suppose, you know, this is, yeah, they didn't come to see the gallery, but they were on their way somewhere else. But we managed to capture this photograph of their visit past the Cambridge Darkroom Gallery. And as you can see, Arjuna sign there, the Whole Foods, who had the basement, the area below us, the gallery space as a packing area. But yeah, so that's just a little bit of local history. Next slide, please. Coverage was pretty good, press-wise, for the opening of the Cambridge Darkroom in its formal state in 1984. First exhibition, which Brian will talk about in a minute, was called Autographs. This got coverage. The graphics were designed by Pavel. You can see his first signage, bottom left. Everyone got featured in the press. Top praise for City's darkroom talents. Great accolade there. And then Creative Camera went and devoted an entire issue later on to the work the darkroom had done. This was 1989, so we're a few years ahead here, but it was worth including here because for a magazine of its standing to give an entire issue over to one organization, I think was pretty impressive at that time. And next slide, please. Brian, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. So our first exhibition was called Autographs. It's probably fair to say that if the people running the Cambridge Darkroom had nothing else, they had cheek. And what we decided to do was to write to well-known photographers and artists working with photography and ask if they would like to contribute a photograph of some description to our opening exhibition. The idea was that what we wanted them to do was not just to submit any picture, but actually something that somehow or other represented themselves. Hence the idea of calling it Autographs. And I think overall we got between about 40 and 45 photographers who contributed to that show. It had a double benefit, really. One, it raised the profile of the Cambridge Darkroom in the wider photographic community and internationally known photographers, but also it made the exhibition space an attractive place for people locally to come and see work by photographers they might not otherwise have seen. So it was an exciting venture. And it included people like Jane Bowen, Faye Godwin, David Hearn, Bill Brandt, established photographers that people may well have known. But there were also other figures who were probably not so well known, such as Sharon Kivland, Mary Marr, Joe Spence, Keith Arnott. And in that, I think we begin to see some aspect of the way in which the darkroom was interested in developing the idea of artists working with photography rather than people who would define themselves as simply as photographers, which some people do and quite rightly do. That's their preferred style. The other thing I think that's interesting about this is, and it alludes to something that Roy has just mentioned, that the graphics and the design for this were by Pavel Buchler, who we met right at the beginning as the person who'd redesigned Creative Camera. So it was a very strong design ethos that he brought to the Cambridge Darkroom, and it established a clear, distinctive brand and identity for the place, something which I don't think any other photo gallery in the country had. And I think we owe a great deal to Pavel in the way that he was able to promote the darkroom, not only through his expertise in arts and all sorts of other things, but simply in terms of the way in which he brought this design ethos to the place. Next slide then, please, Lucy. So some sort of installation shots of the darkroom in operation. The picture on the top left is an archive show called Fen Archive that I curated jointly with Chris Carling. And what we sought to do was to bring together archive photographs from across the Fen area. And in particular, I think it was a success in highlighting the work of 3 women photographers who were very little known and operated really sort of almost in obscurity. So showing them and bringing them to people. The next photograph at the top and the one in the bottom left, I think is an interesting reflection on the way in which the darkroom embraced a wide-ranging community. It was a show associated with architecture in Cambridge that was sponsored by the now lamented company of C&A. They sponsored it, but it also involved the engagement of children and younger people in the show. And there you can see them coming along with their parents. And it was a great success. And we had an interesting debate with, I think, the director of C&A as to whether or not there should just be a simple winner of a prize for a competition like this, or whether everybody ought to have some kind of acknowledgement. It was an interesting difference in philosophy, I think. The top right picture is the opening of the exhibition of work by Angus MacBain, with music in the background. A very social affair with, as is usually the case with openings, a glass of wine. And that's the centre figure there on Angus MacBain's left is Colin Lumley, who was another person who was fundamental to the development of the Cambridge Darkroom. Mark Lumley's father, who was an architect who helped and led the design work on doing the conversion. And then the photograph bottom left is the installation shot of the David Hockney exhibition. Could we just have the next slide, please? Thank you very much. So this is the poster for the David Hockney show. It was an Arts Council travelling exhibition, which we managed to get to come to Cambridge right early on in our life. And I think we treated it as being very much a coup to have actually brought that approach to photography and art to Cambridge at that time. And it, in some ways, the nature of the work suited the gallery space, and with the inspiration of both Mark and Pavel in hanging it, it really looked extremely impressive. So impressive, in fact, that the agent of David Hockney said, "Hockney, you must get down there and see this." So David Hockney came down to Cambridge and went to see the exhibition, met up with the gallery staff, and I think was suitably impressed. I mean, one of my more surreal experiences of working with the Cambridge Darkroom was cycling down Mill Road and seeing David Hockney standing on the corner of St Barnabas Road, I think it was, in a typical David Hockney attire, looking completely out of place, but nevertheless, actually worth seeing him come to Cambridge to actually enjoy the exhibition that we put on. So next slide, please, Lucy, and I think this is the last one. And what we'll get here is a montage of the work that was shown at the Darkroom over a wide period of time. And what you begin to see with this, I think, is that there is a range of documentary work, a range of thematic work, people exploring ideas, work by people who would, as I said earlier, would define themselves as photographers, other people who would define themselves as artists working with photography. We had performance art, we had film shows, and we had talks. And I think the breadth of what we were able to bring to the Cambridge Darkroom and bring to Cambridge was really part of what built its reputation, and meant that, going back to that first diagram, actually sees it has a central part to play in the history of British photography and the development of photography as a creative medium during that very fundamental period.
Thanks, Brian. That's,
Thank you so much, Brian and Roy, for your fantastic, rich presentation with all that amazing archive material on the PowerPoint for us to see. So at this point, we would like to open out to questions from anyone who's here for Brian and Roy. Just like, you can put questions in the chat box or turn your camera and mic on, or raise your hand. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, hi, it was great to hear that account from Brian and Roy, and really, I think, sort of complemented the talk that I was involved in. So I think that backstory is so important in terms of, you know, the origins. It would never have happened without that sort of dedicated group and that kind of intense interest in photography as a medium, and, you know, the work to engage people, and, you know, the bathhouse and the community aspect of the bathhouse. And I think that was so, you know, you can forget that, but it might have been a few years, I think, when we started doing the workshops in the bathhouse, and that was a really rich kind of time with people coming to do the workshops. And we started to work, we worked with young offenders, and as well as the beginners workshops, weekend workshops, and it was very, very powerful, I think, and sort of set the scene for the development into the gallery. So it's great to hear that story. And I think I should just also mention, you know, another aspect of the practice, and that was, we had an education program. We had Adrian Plant and Carol O'Rush worked on it, and we worked with, brought schools into the gallery and worked on programs of work with the schools. So there's a very, you know, as well as maintaining the sort of darkroom kind of access and activity alongside the gallery program. So I think it's just great to commend you on that account. It's really nice to hear and see. I have got a few more photographs that I could add to the archive at some point of actual installations of some of the shows, which I keep meaning to get digitized. But yeah.
I mean, one thing I thought of when doing this was the word radical arts. You know, this whole thing is about radical arts. And I thought, well, how radical were we? I think we were radical in many ways. You know, I don't know what your view on that is, Mark, but you know, we were radical in the approach that we took, which I think pretty fair to say was different to any other gallery, although there were bigger galleries, there were more successful galleries than us, but their approach was different. And I think what we did was sort of push the boundaries, as Brian mentioned, between art, photography, art. I don't know what your views on that might be. How radical is this?
I think it was, well, I mean, I think it was an exciting practice. I mean, it kind of invited a real diversity, sort of engaged with the diversity of the practice that was being undertaken with the medium, and invited, you know, and demonstrated that kind of difference. I think that was, you know, that was very powerful. There's a hand up from Lauren.
Yeah, is it Lauren, if you would like to go ahead?
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. I came to the previous talk and I also really enjoyed it, so I was so happy to see that there was a part 2, and for Alina and Lucy for organising. I was also thinking about that term radical, because it strikes me, I'm a student at the university, that this kind of community-oriented space feels radical, particularly in Cambridge, which is a space that often is so oriented around the university and the institution. And to me, kind of the way that this operated so much, and it was focused around the community and thinking about communities in areas like Fen Ditton, that to me is what feels at the heart of what was pushing boundaries in a place like Cambridge, so kind of geographically. And I was wondering if you could talk about if you had any relationship to the university at all, if students from the university came along, or if you were kind of completely a separate entity function outside of the institutional boundaries. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, Cambridge is quite unique, you know, it's in terms of its population and the activities that go on there. There's very much the town gown split. We didn't have any support from the university other than an interest, I would say. You know, there was certainly no funding, there was no direct connection between us, but we did get students from the university coming to use this. We had a darkroom, you know, they wanted to use a darkroom. So that was one of the things that drew them in. We had a lot of students from the university help with the refurbishment of the building, the bathhouse itself. But in terms of the photography group, we stood apart from the town. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, Mark, Brian?
Yeah. I think that was quite. I think it's quite instructive, in fact, that if you think about a student body, a student engagement, the most significant student engagement actually came from what was then the Cambridge College of Arts and Technology, where we had particular exhibitions related to the work that they were doing, and they played an active part in contributing towards those shows. I do not recall anybody from the university having a similar kind of profile at all. I include the colleges in the university in a sort of portmanteau form, really.
Thank you, that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think I just reiterate this. I think it was the sense of doing something for townspeople and yeah, having that kind of identity. But I mean, having said that, you know, we did collaborate very closely with Kettle's Yard, and that through the relationship with Kettle's Yard, that sort of created a link with the university. And in the latter years, I was there with our chairperson was a Cambridge professor, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Can't remember. Do you remember his name?
Ivan Gaskell?
Ivan Gaskell, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Say that wasn't true. I was right, but yeah. So question coming up.
Yeah, Evelyn.
Hi, thank you so much for a really, really amazing presentation with so many archival images. It was really great to see the images of the kind of interior of the bathhouse as well as it was being kind of redeveloped. And yeah, I wondered how the relationship to the community changed between the St. Matthew's workshops and then Cambridge Darkroom. Because from my very limited knowledge of the shows that were put on in Cambridge Darkroom, a lot of them drew artists from London or much further afield as well. And it seemed like a different relationship to the community, moving away from maybe documenting the community or having community-led or community-based workshops to a kind of more exhibition or also touring exhibition format. So I just wondered whether there was a kind of change in emphasis or ethos around this, between the kind of that moved between the two.
I'll pick up on the first part. I think the fact that we kept the community darkroom in the bathhouse building, as well as running darkrooms in the main gallery building, that kept the interest going locally as well. There were still lots of people use it. There were some people that weren't really interested in the shows that we were putting on, to be honest. You know, some of them may have been not of any interest or above their heads or whatever. But I think it was important to show those because we tried to cater for everybody basically. But I mean, Mark, you've probably got a clearer sense from being on the ground, so to speak, as to how the people locally reacted to a lot of the shows that were put on in later years. Have you?
Yeah, well, I think it is a hard thing to kind of maintain when it has such a strong grounding in the community, and I think that's just reminded me, that's I think it's such a it's as an important part of the history as the latter years, really, that kind of just that powerful kind of sense of community basis. I think we tried to kind of maintain these or develop, have different audiences and also cross-fertilize people's interests, so people who might, expand people's ideas about what photography was as a medium. But I mean, I think we always kept a pretty eclectic kind of program, and we tried to kind of balance what became, at times a more kind of fine art practice with an interest in documentary photography and landscape photography. And so I think I would hope that we kind of maintained, our audiences, not everybody coming to every show. I mean, it was interesting. We had Andrew Nairn at the last event, and Andrew was saying he couldn't believe the kind of pace that we kind of operate. We put on 10, 11 exhibitions a year. Kettle's Yard, I think, is doing sensibly, an exhibition might last for 3 months. So we had this incredible, there was this incredible energy, probably pace and turnover. And we also had, we had stairway exhibitions where we tried to kind of diversify. And as Brian and Roy showed, we worked with, putting on these kind of open exhibitions or thematically, open exhibitions locally, sometimes inviting, so there was a sense of kind of accessibility. I would hope that we maintained that kind of sense of accessibility, and it didn't just become a sort of a removed kind of practice. But yeah, you'd have to kind of ask others really. And also the connectivity through our education program and the activity around the dark rooms. And I would hope that it kind of, in the time, it was a struggle to kind of maintain all those different activities on lots of fronts. But I think, yeah, we did kind of maintain it up to the point I left. I don't know what happened after I left.
I think there is a dimension to this that actually links into the whole way in which the darkroom was and the activities were funded. And I think in that question of the funding model is something at the heart of the question that Evelyn has raised. That on the one hand, we had funding from Cambridge City Council, which was very much interested in the community development side of things. So that was fine. But we also were reliant on Arts Council funding and funding from other organisations. And what they wanted was profile and actually being able to demonstrate that we were at the cutting edge of photography, that we were presenting new and innovative work is much more attractive to organisations like the Arts Council than it is to the City Council. And as a consequence, I think inevitably, in order to maintain the momentum of the Cambridge Darkroom in that art-based field, we began inevitably to move away, and linked into that was the actually sourcing of funding. So I don't think you can divorce that shift from the needs to actually pay for the organisation to actually do what it was doing.
Yeah, that's really interesting about the funding model, because what I was thinking of was whether there was a marked split between the continued community activities which were focused around documentary photography versus then the kind of consideration of artists who used photography but wouldn't identify as photographers, or photography as fine art, or also like pushing the medium of photography, and whether that as kind of associated with kind of like a less community-based practice, I suppose. And that feels like that connects to that sense of the funding model as well. These like two styles or different styles of photography being connected to those different funding models, and also like practices and communities.
Yeah, I think the whole thing was a sort of fantastic juggling act of actually trying to keep those competing facets of what we were doing alive, and actually being able to develop them all. And I think it was a huge tribute to Mark and Pavel in particular, that over a long period of time we were able to do that. And there is a story to be told, I think, about the eventual demise of the darkroom, where that balance was not actually achieved. And as a consequence, the organisation suffered as a result of that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah, go ahead, Alina.
I know we've spoken about this before, but and you also mentioned it in your previous talk, but I thought people might be interested to hear a bit about Brian and Roy, what you have had to say about how the community also itself was changing in connection to all of these politics, and the fact that the kind of redevelopment plan was also a kind of gentrification project. And obviously we know that kind of the St Matthews area now is a place where working class people absolutely cannot afford to live there. So yeah, if you could
yeah, well, maybe the planning policy should have been to knock it all down and build council flats, which would then have been sold off under right to buy, and people still wouldn't be able to afford to live there. It is the eternal dilemma, and I think as planners we were quite proud of the way in which the attitude that was the elected members of the council took towards the future of the St Matthews area was to try to actually maintain that community in as much as you can within a market economy. And I think on the whole it was successful. You can see that success, I guess, in house prices, but nevertheless, it still remains an area that has an integrity and a value, I think, in terms of its community life of its own. There is a little anecdote which is probably worth telling, actually, because one of the pictures that Roy showed, or there's two pictures that Roy showed, one of which was related to removing heavy lorries out of the area. And there's a little sketch of a van or a lorry being moved out, and it has D&H on the side of it. So it's D&H contractors. They were major building contractors who had a depot in Hooper Street, and they brought heavy lorries into the area, and they were an absolute menace. Another photograph that Roy showed was of Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Philip in a Rolls Royce trotting down Gwyder Street. And where they were going to was the former premises of D&H contractors. D&H contractors having been paid by the City Council effectively to move out. And the building was then turned into the Women's Resources Centre, and they were going to open the Women's Resources Centre. So to me, those two images are a metaphor for the way in which the area was changing, and illustrate the impact that it had. So that the Women's Resources Centre was a continuation of that community engagement, but with a much more citywide role.
Yeah. Anything else? No, I think are we done on questions? Yeah.
Yeah, if anyone else has any more questions, go ahead now, but otherwise, thank you so much for this great discussion. We're really I felt like this discussion is continuing things that we've discussed before. The super interesting tension between the shift from community-based photography into the photography artist as photographer or photographer artist. Oh, we've got another question.
Yeah,
hi, yeah, I actually just wanted to ask the question of how are you guys practicing photography today, and how are you managing with the expenses of photography and film as a medium?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm supposed to be retired. Yeah, but I mean, I'm still active in photography. I still have a darkroom. I still do it the old-fashioned way as well as digital. So yeah, I still like to maintain an interest, but it is hellishly expensive. It's crazy, and so I really do feel sorry for people that try to pursue it in the more traditional way these days. Digital's okay; it's cheap enough, I guess. And the things are changing all the time. So we soon won't need cameras at all. It'll all be done by AI for us. Brian, what do you think?
Well, yeah, not having ever been a professional photographer, but simply a planner who was interested in photography, I guess I still dabble. For me, I think one of the advantages of the digital world is that it's relatively cheap and straightforward to produce photo books. And that, I suppose that's probably the way I spend any time that I do spend on photography, doing that, or putting something on a blog. But you're right, it is expensive. I recently had the experience of going into an independent retailer, a camera shop in Cambridge, and asking for a film for a roll of FP4, which he wanted £12 for. If you go around the corner into a chain shop, side street, you can get it for £6.75 or something or other, something like that. So it is expensive, but it needn't be that expensive if you go to the right place. But if you are keen on promoting and continuing with analog photography, please do.
Thanks very much. That's great.
And Mark's no longer a photographer.
I'm afraid I became an architect, but I'm sort of in process of kind of retiring, so I might become a photographer again, I think.
Okay.
But there are I think darkrooms are a sad loss, really, aren't they? I just discovered that there is one close to where I live in London where I can rent, which I might go.
But I think they were fairly unusual back then when we set ours up, but even rarer now. But you don't need them, I guess.
They're magical.
Are you practicing photography? Lucy?
Yes, I am, and yeah, definitely find the comment on AI taking things over very funny and darkly actually relevant one. But yeah, I'm practice with film mostly as well, and it's $20 a roll where I'm based, so it's crazy, and that's before developing costs. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Luckily, I'm in the city that does have a community darkroom. And yeah, kind of, it's still expensive to be an active member in, but this is pretty.
Sure. Keep it up.
Okay.
So maybe that's, unless anyone has any final questions, maybe that is time to wrap up. But I know we'll keep having these conversations, and yeah, just if everyone can virtually say a big thank you to Brian, Roy, and also Mark.
It's a pleasure.
Personal speaker, thank you.
Glad you were there, Mark, because you were able to help out a bit there.
It's great to see you again.
Yeah, must meet up for a drink sometime.
Yeah, we must.
We've got another hand up.
Yeah.
Another hand up, is it?
I think it's a clap.
Oh, it's a clap.
Oh, it's a clap, is it? Oh, right. Oh, sorry. I'm a bit of a
Thank you,
Zoom
everyone
virgin,
that
I'm afraid.
Great having an audience. I think we got more to this than we did to the original talk.
And thank you, Lucy, and Anna for organising it. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, pleasure. And just to plug our kind of final event is happening, as Lucy said, on the 2nd of June. If you'd like to find out more about the Kettle's Yard residency program in the 1980s, we'll be hearing from Hilary Gresty, Joe Stockham, and we'll be looking at some artist films that were shown at that time. So if you're interested in any of the sort of hints at that history as well, you're more than welcome to come along to that.
Is that online, or is that going to be a live event?
That's going to be live.
Okay.
And again, we'll record it and put it online and share it with everyone. So
Yeah,
if you're not able to make it on the day.
I think.
Brilliant. All right. Well, thanks everyone, and wishing you a great evening, and yeah, hope to see you all again.
Yeah, likewise.
Very much.
Cheers.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it very much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thanks.
Yeah, well, yeah, let's hope the recording worked.
Don't tempt fate, Roy.
Don't go and reformat the disc. Okay. Right. Okay, we'll sign off then. Yeah, and I mean, you send us a link when you've got this up on wherever we're going to put it. Yeah, and be interesting. But yeah, really glad Mark attended.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Good.
Okay. Anything else you need? You know where we are.
No, we'll do. We'll keep in touch, and I'll write to you about all the sort of all the invoicing stuff. We'll get you paid as soon as possible.
Yeah. Okay, that's great.
Yeah. Thank you both.
Okay.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.